Welcome to the World of Eora, a news and lore podcast about the Pillars of Eternity games, as well as Obsidian Entertainment's upcoming release, Avowed. Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of the World of Eora. I'm your host Eric, aka Gingerino. Thanks everyone for joining me on another episode as we dive into the history, lore, and game mechanics for Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2 as we gear up for the release of Avowed. For those curious of why we pair all those games together, it's because they share the same fantasy setting known as Eora. So if you find yourself new here, perhaps you're looking forward to Avowed, or you're just jumping into Pillars of Eternity because you've heard of it from all the marketing for Avowed, welcome to the show. On this show, we go through the lore of these games and just talk about the world at large because A, we're nerds and we're geeks, we appreciate this kind of stuff, and also B, as we gear up for the release of Avowed, we just want to have a better understanding of the world, a more appreciated sense for the writing and the nuance that's going to be within that game. And so that's why we go through the lore on this show. As well, any news or anything that comes up about the game or about anything related on this show will come up as well. In today's episode, we're going to be talking a little bit about the creatures, the bestiary, apparently. I've been calling it bestiary for a very long time, and I recently saw a video where Josh Sawyer pointed out that it's pronounced bestiary. So, egg on my face there, but whatever. Hopefully I can train myself out of it. But regardless, today we're going to be talking about some types of creatures that we can see. Now, I've already done an episode like this. I'm going to be covering some things on constructs and vessels and soul-based soldiers. I'll get a little bit more in what I mean in a second. I've already covered some creatures within this category of beast or whatever you want to call it, referring to my episode on the undead, which would be episode number 65. So if you're interested in learning about the undead, how they're created, and the lifespan of the undead, go ahead and check out episode 65. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about the other half of the category that is vessel. And vessels are essentially creatures that have some sort of weird soul manipulation having to do with them. Their soul hasn't quite left the body, or the soul has entered into a new body or item, and that's created the vessel creature that we'll see before you within the game. In specific, we're going to be talking about constructs, flesh constructs. We're going to be talking about animats, which are pieces of armor infused with the soul of another person. We're going to be talking about wicts, which are children that were born without a soul, and then they kind of had a way of solving that problem by placing an animal soul in them. And we're also going to discuss death guards, which are people who just had souls that refused to leave the body even after they died. So we're going to cover all of those and a couple of variants of each of those creatures in just a sec. No news to go over for the show today or anything Avowed related, but something Obsidian related, if you didn't already know. Grounded and Pentiment, two titles by Obsidian, are going to be releasing on other platforms besides Xbox. So up until now, they've been exclusive to Xbox, but now they're going to be releasing on other platforms. I particularly want to point you in the direction of Pentiment on the Nintendo Switch, simply because Pentiment is a very, very good game for portable or handheld modes of play. So if you haven't already played Pentiment through the Xbox Game Pass Cloud on your mobile device, I recommend, if you have the money for it, get it on Nintendo Switch and play that portably. It's a wonderful game. Grounded also plays good on portable as well, but it is, a 3D and open world sandbox type of game. So depending on your preferences, you may or may not like that. Me personally, I'm a bigger fan of Grounded, but I very much appreciate Pentiment. I'm just not as much of a history buff as some others, but it's definitely a better game on mobile than I would say maybe on console and the big screen. I don't know why. That's my opinion. If you disagree with me, worldoфeora@gmail.com, tear me a new one. Anyways, let's dive into today's lore.
I'm curious. What exactly did you find there?
So all of today's lore we're going to be getting from the Pillars of Eternity Wikipedia. I have checked with the official lore from the guidebooks to see if a lot of this stuff corresponds to the official lore that is written in those things, and so we'll be going through that today. The reason that I really wanted to go through this as a topic today is simply because I think there's a large chance that we're going to see creatures like this in the game of Avowed, but also because I just find the lore for this kind of stuff fascinating. So to kind of back up a second, creatures in fantasy games and movies and books and all that would be classified as a vessel creature are not something unheard of. We've seen things like this many a times. However, the unique flavor of a construct or an animat or things like that within other fantasy media, the unique way in which they come about and how they operate, that differs from source to source. And I find the lore behind constructs within the world of Eora particularly fascinating because it's, like many things in this world, tied deeply to the cycle of reincarnation that exists in this world called the Wheel, and it's tied deeply to the existence of souls in creatures and nature and just the ambient environment around you. These are two very big topics for stories and games told within the world of Eora, and it's not a surprise that this is tied very closely here with vessel-based creatures. So what's an example of a creature in the vessel category? So the first creature that I want to talk about is an Animat. An Animat is a race of creature in Pillars of Eternity. They're essentially metal automatons made with souls that are extracted from warriors and fused with bronze armor. So the idea here being that you have a set of armor, you take a soul out of a warrior, you put the soul into the armor, which will theoretically not die, at least for as long of a time. And now that soul empowers the armor to be animated, and it can now, in a sense, wander around in this armor and perform the duties it wants. Now, here's the thing. A lot of people might think at this point, okay, you put the soul of a creature into this body of armor, and now they are just fully conscious and aware within this body of armor, and they can live on as long as that armor does not rust or degrade or get destroyed. And certainly that potential is there within the fantasy world of Eora, but more often than not, the soul that gets put into this armor doesn't hold the same level of consciousness. They can only follow simpler instructions, or they only have like a goal in mind or a thing that they are essentially existing to perform, and they have that sort of like limited memory and limited consciousness. So it's not just you put a soul in a body of armor, and that body of armor is now just a fully conscious version of the person it was before. It's like, no, it's an entirely new creature in a sense. It's just being energized by the soul. It's not necessarily housing its consciousness. It is technically there, but it's not quite to that level that we might think there. The official description for Animats are as follows. Animats were initially created to serve as guardians for royal tombs. Their earliest creators bound the souls of their strongest warriors and servants to intricate sculptures, made of various materials in accordance to the rank of the soul captured within. As the knowledge of the technique for this process became more widespread, more powerful animancers started creating their own animats to serve as personal guardians using whatever weapons and materials that lay at hand. So let's break down this first half of what we have here. Animats, which is an interesting word. I take it to kind of mean like animated, like it's a short version of animate, which is what you're kind of doing. You're animating these bodies of armor by putting a soul into them. It says here they were initially created to serve as guardians for royal tombs, which is consistent with the lore that we heard of, that they have limited memory and consciousness, and they basically just follow a simple instruction. Or they're created with the idea that I must protect this area, and so they will attack anyone that is trespassing. How it works is that the creator of an animat, which would be a scientist known as an animancer who studies the soul and the stuff that souls are made of, these creators would bind the souls of strong warriors and servants to intricate sculptures, such as a bronze set of armor. And they would relate the materials they used in terms of ranking the soul captured. So they're using loyal souls, people who are happily giving their souls for this purpose. And as we'll learn in a second, when it comes to animats, that's very important. You need to have a soul that is devoid of doubt, that is loyal to a fault, so that it will not degrade, it will not die faster, and that it will be more effective in what you're building it to do. So the soul's loyalty and its willingness to become an animat is actually part of that process. Animats can only be created through the use of loyal souls that hold a powerful dedication to protecting their charges. While the ritual to create them can still be performed on unwilling subjects, a lack of resolve in a participant's soul can result in abominations, which immediately attempt to destroy themselves in a violent manner, often inflicting collateral damage in the process. Even successful creations remain vulnerable to the onset of doubt, and most animat creators take great care to not allow such doubts to manifest. And so that's the basic idea behind an animat. And I think an animat is a good place to start on this episode because it gives the base idea for what we're talking about with vessel creatures. You have an object like a bronze set of armor, or even a recently deceased body, or anything else really, and you're finding a way to bind a person's soul to that object or thing, and that soul energy animates that object. It doesn't necessarily inhabit it like a conscious creature, although there is definitely research happening during the times of Pillars of Eternity to see if people can do that successfully. But the idea behind animats is that these souls are powering and animating these objects, and that they can be, for lack of a better term, programmed to do something. And in the case of animats, the loyalty of the soul matters, as we've already discussed. So these animat creators have to be very careful to make sure that these are very, very loyal people and that they have no doubts in what they're doing, because having doubts in the soul, it sounds like it will slowly degrade it over time or make it more vulnerable. If you try to create an animat against an unwilling subject, there's a higher probability that they will just attempt to kill themselves and possibly everything around them as well as soon as they're created. So that's an animat. If you're trying to picture something in your mind's eye of what an animat looks like, I would just picture a set of armor that is able to move. If you're picturing pieces of armor that are disparate from each other, you can kind of picture like a purple ethereal set of like limbs between each armor piece. That is kind of way, like almost like a phantasmic force between the armor parts, if you will. The thing about animats, though, is that they are largely created in the distant past, at least by the times of Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2, as well as Avowed. Animats were created by an ancient society of people known as the Ingwithans, which are long since gone. The Ingwithans have long since disappeared off the face of Eora, and there's a lot of mystery behind what's going on about them. You learn a lot about them in Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2, but I'm not going to dive into that lore here today. And so animats are something that are results of that Ingwithan society long ago. And that level of skill in the science of animancy is not seen as much in the modern world because a lot of that knowledge was lost. And so we don't really see any modern versions of animats quite often. I mean, I'm not saying you don't. That there definitely are examples of them, one such being as the Forge Knight. But the point of what I'm saying is that they're not as commonplace as they would have been back when they were initially created by the Ingwithans. But to discuss the Forge Knight is an animat, essentially, that is created during the times of Pillars of Eternity 1. And you, as a player character, can kind of help in the creation of them. You can be a positive or negative force in whether or not they do get created. Forge Knights are unique modern animats that are created by a faction of people known as the Crucible Knights, which are part of the city of Defiance Bay, which is the major city settlement that we see in Pillars of Eternity 1. So if you're playing Pillars of Eternity 1, you go to the major city of Defiance Bay. In that city is a faction of people called the Crucible Knights. They're essentially blacksmithing soldiers, and they at some point want to create something called a Forge Knight, which is basically this modern, unique version of an animat. They're doing this to increase their manpower and reduce, I suppose, casualties with their own people, because if an animat gets destroyed, then, it's not as a big deal if one of your soldiers are. As well, the Crucible Knights have got a lot on their hands at the time of Pillars of Eternity 1. There's a lot of things going on, and so they're kind of spread out a lot. Being able to develop Forge Knights to kind of help out with the manpower would be really helpful. And so that's an example of an animat that we see in Pillars of Eternity 1 in a modern sense. But it doesn't necessarily go entirely as planned. There are different outcomes in the quest that I'm not going to dive into, but because this is, in a sense, newer research for this particular faction, they don't necessarily know what souls to take things from. So, for example, the Forge Knights that these Crucible Knights were creating, they were sourcing the souls from disreputable merchants instead of, loyal subjects. People that technically the Knights were sworn to punish, and so they would be opposed to that, right? And so as you can imagine, these Forge Knights have a pretty high probability of being created in a rather volatile and violent state. If you want to know more about what happens to the end of that quest line, just because that's interesting, go ahead and check out Pillars of Eternity 1. It's a great game. Obviously, I think so, because I'm here, so I'm kind of biased. But regardless, moving on. So that's an animate. And I'm going to use that idea behind talking about the rest of the creatures that we talk about here, such as a construct, which is a broader term of creature. Honestly, an animate could also be called a construct as like a category above that. But usually when we talk about constructs in Pillars of Eternity, we're talking about a particular kind known as the flesh construct, which is a really disturbing title, I'll admit that, but that's what they are, flesh constructs. Flesh constructs are created by animancers and powered by a captive soul. However, unlike animats, they are not dependent on the will and loyalty of the bound soul. So therefore, flesh constructs cannot be undone by doubt. They're capable of following simple instructions. But they also tend to be shorter lived than animats, because the energy and faith in an animate soul can sustain it for decades or centuries. The soul bound to a flesh construct will gradually fade away with its physical body. Because of the lack of loyalty in a flesh construct, they don't tend to live as long. The body will eventually stop responding to the soul's energy, and it will just kind of, for lack of a better word, power down, but it just basically fully die. People who are against animancy will use flesh constructs as an image against animancy, because as you can imagine, animancy in the world of Eora has got a lot of people that are for it, but also a lot of people that are against it. You're performing scientific experiments on people's souls, for goodness sake. Like it's not just like checking to see if you put these two chemicals in a beaker together, what happens. It's also like you're messing with these souls that perpetuate into different lives within the future. You could unintentionally cause very powerful negative side effects on a person's soul that will essentially last forever until that soul is worn away and quote unquote dies. So like there's a lot of strong opinions in the world of Eora on the presence of animancy, whether it should exist at all, whether it should be heavily regulated or just freely researched by whoever wants to do it. And I expect we're going to see discussions like that in Avowed as well. We're going to see people who are pro-animancy and anti-animancy. But flesh constructs are often used as an anti-animancy propaganda kind of a thing, because they see it as like, well, this person was unwilling to become a flesh construct, and yet these people just did it anyways, right? So that's clearly an ethical violation. And so that's kind of a proponent against animancy. And this is controversial, obviously, but it's even true amongst animancers themselves. Like, creation of a flesh construct is controversial. Some see the process as a soul lobotomy and believe that the soul should be allowed to pass on to the next life rather than used as mindless fuel for a body. That's what it says at the bottom of this article here that I'm reading. And so there's a sense here that some people view souls as just stuff that you can use for whatever you feel like. And if you have the power to do it, then why should anyone say otherwise? Which is a pretty brutal thing to think, but I'm pretty sure you can find thinking like that throughout human history, and probably even in modern history or presently as well. That's definitely a dialogue, that's definitely a narrative that's going on in the Pillars of Eternity games, and might be something that we see in Avowed as well. In playing Pillars of Eternity, we can run into flesh constructs, rotting flesh constructs, which are exactly what they sound like, and unstable constructs. And so I would imagine these are constructs that are created that are, as they say, unstable. You can tell that in the game because if you get close enough, they will self-destruct, so they just explode. They're quite volatile. The description for an unstable construct, at least according to the fandom website, is different than a regular construct. And so we'll read that here to see what lore they have. Wizards have experimented with constructs for centuries, but the process of transferring soul essence out of a living body into something else, be it stone, metal, or bone, has always been a difficult one. As the body of research on the subject has grown, thanks in large in part to animancy, methods have improved. Yet transferring an intact soul, one that remains personality, memory, and intelligence, is harder still. Ethelmore, the head of the Brackenbury Sanitarium in Defiance Bay, is one of the few successes. Proponents argue that perfecting this method will allow Kith to extend their own lives without degenerating into vampires, ghouls, and other flesh-eating vessels. Others contend that the metallic monstrosities that fill clandestine animancy labs are more horrific still. It's been estimated that for every truly sentient construct, there are scores, if not hundreds, of maimed souls trapped in half-finished bodies. Okay, so there's a lot alluded to here, and we've already kind of discussed most of the stuff going on. The main thing being that, as I've mentioned before, the idea that you can take an intact soul that is the seat of personality, memory, and consciousness and transfer that to another object made of stone, metal, or bone, or anything else, and it retains that same level of consciousness, it has all that memory, it has the personality that it was in before, to retain all that is very, very difficult, and you do not see it happening very often. There is an example in Pillars of Eternity where there was success for this, in a person named Ethelmore. If you are playing Pillars of Eternity 1, you go to the big city of Defiance Bay, as I said. There's a section of that city that houses a building called the Brackenbury Sanitarium, where a lot of animancy research is done. And the head of the Brackenbury Sanitarium, Ethelmore, is actually a statue. And this statue houses the soul of Ethelmore. And so there has been a successful experiment of this where people took the soul of Ethelmore and they put it into the statue that is embedded into the building itself, and this person now essentially is the head of the Brackenbury Sanitarium until I guess the statue falls apart, or something happens and the soul isn't there anymore. That is an example where they have been able to keep a soul intact in this transference, but it is not an easy thing to do. And it's something that you actually might not recognize for the longest time. You go to Brackenberry Sanitarium as a new-time player, you talk to the statue, and you're like, oh yeah, they put a soul into a statue. I guess that makes sense for some of the things I've seen here. But you don't realize just how rare it is to see that. And you also don't really realize how many times did they try to perform this on other people before they think they figured it out and then tried it on Ethelmore, right? How many bodies were there in trying to figure out how to do this before they decided to try it on Ethelmore? Like, that is something you don't really think about, you know? And I like Ethelmore. You talk with them and they seem pretty straightforward. I have a rather pleasant disposition towards them. But when you stop and you think about that, how they got in that position and what probably the research that had to be done and the people that very likely got the bad end of a stick, to put it mildly, within animancy experiments. I mean, we never really find out for sure everything that happened, but we don't know the specifics. Just the idea alone, though, is pretty horrific. And that's not the only time we see things like that. In the White March DLC, which, by the way, if you want to watch a Let's Play of any of this stuff, I highly recommend watching Centigraphs on YouTube, Sentegraphs. He just finished all of Pillars of Eternity 1 and the White March DLC. And he does what's called a lore through. It's very thorough, and it's very well done. I recommend watching that if you want to watch anything like that. But there's this one instance in the White March DLC where you meet, I think his name is Galvano or something like that. I'm probably mistaken it, but he had been experimenting on this idea over and over again, these unstable constructs that he was creating as a result of trying to get a soul intact on to others. And so you have all these like pieces of metal that just have a person's soul half-assed put inside of it, and that they're just there, trapped, and they can't do anything. Like, that's pretty awful. I would say unethical largely, right? But makes for good game, doesn't it? So with these ideas in mind of how vessel creatures are created outside of the undead, which are people who tried to make themselves immortal by doing things to make their soul not leave their body, and they essentially turn into zombies, is the short way of doing it. There are other ways of a vessel creature being created. For one, in the example of a death guard. Death guards are extremely rare and sometimes created upon the demise of a particularly determined individual who refuses to leave the physical world for the beyond. That's a capital B, beyond. That's where you go after you die. What this is essentially saying here is a death guard is a person who was so determined to not let their soul leave their body that the soul actually didn't leave the body. Because how it works in this world is when you die, something happens that causes your soul to leave your physical body, and then you go to the beyond. That's how the process of death works, and then that soul will eventually come back and go into a new body, and thus the cycle of reincarnation continues. But if you just have such a strong determination and will that, no, my soul will stay, I am not going to die, then you can become what's called a death guard, where your soul doesn't leave your body. This happens a lot, particularly to paladins, because of their deep zeal, if you would. Priests as well, or any exceptional zealot, can have this fate, and it is considered a terrible transformation, because a death guard will occupy the former body that their soul was housed in, but because of the energy of the soul remaining in the physical body, it rapidly consumes all the flesh of the body, leaving only bones behind. As a result, death guards are often driven mad by living in this state, and they're extremely terrifying and extremely powerful. So if you can imagine you have such a persistent soul that you refuse to die because you have something you need to do, that your soul doesn't leave your body, it gets stuck in your body, and it deteriorates your physiological form to the point that you actually are driven mad. So now you have a soul stuck into this skeleton that's extremely powerful, very erratic, and can't really die anymore. I mean, at a certain point, the soul will have to leave the skeleton body, but I suppose, because the bones get ground into dust or something like that. But still, the idea that it's trapped there for that long in this state is kind of a terrifying thing. And because they are technically dead, there is this kind of like small connection that the soul in this death guard has to the beyond that allows them to access magic from that plane, if you will. It allows them to do things like summon balls of flame and shadows and kill people with just saying a word. So if you're wondering where it is that death guards get magic from when you fight them in the game, that's where they get that from. The last creature that I want to talk about is called a Wicht. And I saved this one for last because it's probably the most disconcerting of most. Or concerning? I don't know which word to use there for some reason all of a sudden, but either way, it's the most disturbing in my mind, especially since I recently became a dad a couple years ago. You'll understand what I mean in just a second. So a wict is a type of creature that is the result of putting an animal soul into a child that is born without one. So in the world of Eora, especially once you start thinking about the soul does exist and the cycle of reincarnation exists and there's a science where you can study the soul and there are soul mechanics and metaphysics, you think of all these things and you start to like really ground with this fantasy world in real ideas. There are instances where something like this can happen, where children are born without souls, and as the result of trying to solve this, because it does result in a major issue, people did things which ended up creating wicts. So to give you a backstory, in the game of Pillars of Eternity, there is a huge crisis going on within the Deerwood, the setting for the first Pillars of Eternity game, known as Widewind's Legacy. And that's the name given to a crisis known as the Hollowborn Crisis. So Widewind's Legacy and the Hollowborn Crisis are kind of like interchangeable depending on the context of the sentence you're using them in. But the idea behind it was that basically all of a sudden people were having babies, but these babies were born without souls. And what that meant is that these infants and children and all that were just void. They were just husks, essentially. They would just sit there and breathe and stare forward, doing nothing. I imagine they found ways to feed them, obviously, but they had no personality. They weren't forming memories, and there was no consciousness within this creature. You were just a creature that was merely existing. So this is a huge problem, not just because, the very, very awful thing that people would be going through where you're trying to have a family or have a child, and you just end up having a hollowborn child. Like that's an incredibly difficult thing that someone would go through if such a thing was possible. Aside from that, the next generation of your society is essentially not being born. You have all the children there, but no soul inside of them, and so there's no one that's going to carry on the next generation of work, the next generation of people. Like, it's essentially just going to stop there unless you can solve this. So it's actually a pretty big crisis, not just on a personal level, but on a societal one as well. And a number of solutions were kind of proposed as a way to solve this, a number of those solutions being within the science of animancy. However, this particular solution that they found, which was to take the soul of an animal, like a creature, and transport that soul into the body of the empty, I guess you could say the void body of the child that didn't have a soul. That was a solution they tried. And you might think, why would that work? And I'm sure they thought that too in the history of this fantasy world. But they did it, and then the kids started being alive again. Now, in our minds, we might think, well, you put an animal soul into the body of a human, let's say. Wouldn't they start behaving like a dog or whatever animal it is that you took it from? And again, in this world, it's not so straightforward like that. This stuff is more energizing kind of a thing than anything else. But that being said, there is a difference between an animal soul and a kith soul, which is like a little more of a sentient kind of a creature. There's definitely differences. And so these children started being animated again. They started having consciousness and forming memories, and it seemed like they were behaving like normal children. And so it seemed like there was a solution going on. Problem that happened, though, is when these children that were infused with the soul of an animal entered into puberty, something about that just changed them completely, and they turned into these wild, kind of like undead-like creatures. And they're not technically dead, but they turned into these wild, vicious beasts, essentially. They don't look like, they kind of have reminiscent forms of children, but they definitely look a lot more like a beast than anything else. They're described as appearing as children between the age of 9 and 11. They have pale skin, purple eyes that glow white. Their fingers and toes have grown unnaturally long and misshapen and end with large talons. The teeth are also large and sharp. So that's a wict, right? This is a child that was infused with an animal soul, starts entering into puberty, and then they basically go feral, and they become these completely new creatures called wicts. Which I don't want to dwell on this too long because it's pretty dark when you think about it. But like, my goodness, like that's crazy. And I kind of don't want to see wict in Avowed. Ever since having my firstborn son, I've become incredibly soft towards this kind of thing. The fact that there are these like kids technically running around and they're enemies to put down, if you will, like just the idea behind that is just so dark. But hey man, makes for great fantasy, makes for great games and great stories, I'll give it that. But anyways, that's the end of the lore for this episode. That's all the stuff about constructs, animats, and others related to the vessel category of creatures. Now, what might this have to do with Avowed?
Is an oath worth the weight of a crown?
I think the obvious application to the game of Avowed is that we would see vessel creatures in the world of Avowed, and I don't see any reason why that wouldn't necessarily occur. The specific one of the Wict, I don't think will exactly happen, because the Wict happened as a response to the Hollowborn Crisis, which was located in the Deerwood, so that was a very geographically specific place for that to occur, although there could be something like that in Avowed. However, flesh constructs or animats or even death guards, I think that is all very possible that we could see that in Avowed. We already know that there is an animancy lab. We see a quick glimpse of an animancy lab in the June 2023 trailer for Avowed, like something very brief. And so there's the chance they might be experimenting on things like that. Death guards can exist in ancient ruins, and so the idea that we might be exploring Avowed and find an ancient cave or something, or an ancient ruin, there could be death guards there as well. Animats existing by the Ingwithan people, there's definitely a chance that other civilizations or the Ingwithans themselves were in the living lands and they created animats. So it definitely seems more than probable that we will run into a construct or an animat of some sort in Avowed. Whether or not they will be the same like we see them in Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2, or if it'll be a unique variant, or if there'll be a unique history or lore or story behind them, I don't know. Personally, I kind of hope for something different, because then we can learn more about it. As well, actually, the other side of this is that we will run into these kind of creatures or people that have intact souls, right? So just like I was talking about, Ethelmore was a soul inside of a statue. There might be a chance that in Avowed we run into a person like that. Who knows? Maybe one of our companions will be something like that. Will be a piece of plate armor that walks around, and we think that there's a person inside of it, and then we find out halfway through their companion quest that, like, yeah, actually, there's nothing in here. Like a crazy animancer put my soul into this body as a form of experiment, and I escaped. And then, you have to go back to that animancer's lab and exact revenge, or, find a way to convince this companion to forgive the person. Who knows, right? Something like that could happen, which would be a badass quest. I would love that. That'd be so cool. But even if we don't have a companion like that, we could run into an NPC that has a similar story, or just an NPC like that. How ridiculous would it be if you went to go to like a merchant shop, and then there was just this like mascot outside of the merchant shop that had a soul stuck inside of it that was basically just there to promote the business because they love the business so much. I don't know. Obviously something that'd be ridiculous, but hey, humor in games is great. Pillars of Eternity is definitely got very humorous stuff in it, despite the dark topics we were just talking about. So yeah, I think there's a huge chance we could see something like this in Avowed. I don't think our player character will likely have anything to do with it. I don't see us ever having something like that happen. Although it would be an interesting quest to see if we could have our soul put into another body and then return our soul back to our original body, maybe for a short period of time. Perhaps we're trying to infiltrate something and we need to do that. That'd be a cool quest, but I doubt that'll happen. You never know. But yeah, so there's the applications for what we might see for Avowed. If any of you listening have an idea of ways that this can be implemented in Avowed, if you have any ideas, send me an email, worldoфeora@gmail.com. Other than that, I don't really have much else to talk about. In what I'm playing, I finally finished Blasphemous. I almost gave up on that game because I ended up at one of the bosses, Chrysanta, and she was killing me so fast. I literally, it would take me more time to get to her than for how quickly she would kill me. So I had to grind. Well, I say grind, but I did, the Metroidvania equivalent of grinding, which is just exploring all the areas you missed. I had to go through all these other areas, find power-ups that I had missed, and then return a couple hours later and give her another shot. And it worked. Whatever I did must have paid off, and I was able to beat her. So I'm really happy that I got past that and then pushed on to the end of the game. I did not like the ending of the game because I got the bad ending, and I don't really know what it was I was supposed to do to get the good ending. So that kind of was a letdown. Like, it was like, I put 14 hours into this game, Mr. Developer Game Kitchen, and I don't even know how to get the good ending. Like, what was I supposed to do? So like, I felt like my time was a little devalued in that particular way. But when I look at the way the game is, where it's a very not hand-holdy type of game, and that the lore is very obscure and the story is very obscure, like, it makes sense. it's like it's cohesive. I get it. And so like I'm not actually mad about it. I'm just sort of like was like, for frick's sakes, I know that I'm not going to figure it out. So I ended up looking up some of that stuff, which whatever. If you have an opinion on that, whatever. That's my time. I'll use it the way I see fit. But yeah, it was phenomenal. Like I haven't enjoyed a good Metroidvania in many, many years. And so it was really nice to get back into. And I'm really hoping to get into the second game. I might get it when it's on sale or something. I currently have a huge backlog of games I need to get into. I did promise those of you who were interested, and a couple of you were, that I would give an update on Monster of the Week, which is a tabletop role-playing game. Just think of Buffy the Vampire Slayer or the TV show Supernatural, but played over a tabletop like you would with D&D, and that's essentially what you have with Monster of the Week. I started a game as an impromptu one-shot with zero preparation. It just was flying by the seat of our pants, and we all ended up liking it so much that we're making a long-form game out of it. The short version of everything that's going on in our game is that my players are playing as themselves, and they put a magical totem on the monster playbook for the game, and now all the monsters in that playbook are entering into real life, and they're trying to figure out how to deal with them. But there's weird things going on, and there's a mysterious bad guy in the background, which I'm not going to get into because they might listen to this. And yeah, it's been a lot of fun. I'm 3 sessions in as the GM, also called the Keeper, and it's been a good time. If any of you have played Monster of the Week and you have tips or ideas, please reach out to me. This is super, super fun, but I'm brand new to it. worldofaora@gmail.com. But that's going to be it. Sorry, I kind of rambled there at the end. Thanks for listening to today's episode and talking about constructs and animats and things that we might see in Avowed. Thanks for joining me on that. If you have any comments, questions, concerns, etc., send me an email, worldofaora@gmail.com, or follow me on Twitter @worldofaora. I mostly just post updates when episodes are out, but I will occasionally put a lore tidbit out here or there. Lastly, if you'd like to support the show, please feel free to go on my Ko-fi account, which is ko-fi.com/worldofaora. I was told today, I just got a message that the link isn't working, so I'm going to try to figure out why that might be. But yeah, if you want to support the show, that's a way you can do that. Or you just keep listening to the show. Rate and review is a good way to help support the show. But if you just enjoy it, then just continue to enjoy it. I'm happy to make this content for you. But yeah, that's everything today. Thanks, everybody. I've been your host, Eric, aka Gingerino, and I'll see you guys next time.